and I am the Associate Director for Learning and Accessibility at UNC Greensboro, and we're ready to start our 10 o'clock session here today. The session is titled Being Intentional and Connecting Inclusive Communication Best Practices. Our presenter is Emily Gregg, and do have just a few things we want to share before we get started. The presentation will be recorded, both live human captioning, our CART services, as well as our ASL will be provided for this session, as well as all of our sessions. Just as with the previous session, want to make sure you're using the Q&A feature to post your questions. We will be moderating and monitoring the Q&A for questions, so please feel free to use that. If you have any issues with Zoom, please let us know by sending an email to accessibility@ncstate.edu. And I'm going to stop sharing here. And just to also give you a little bit of information about our presenter before we get started. So Emily is an accomplished creative communicator with 15 years in the field. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in graphic design from Meredith College, where she was president of the American Institute for Graphic Arts and editor for the Colton Review, which is a literary journal. She has also worked in various industries, including nonprofit, local government, healthcare IT, as well as higher education. She's passionate about typography, color theory, as well as UX design. And outside of work, she volunteers for the Piedmont Environmental Alliance and the local board of elections. All right, so I think we are ready to hand it over to Emily.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to the committee for having me here today. I'm very excited to talk about inclusive communications best practices. So let me get my screen shared. Oh, got a little ambitious there. All right, can everybody see this?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. All right, let me do one thing. Let me try to get this out of the browser. Let me see. Sorry, let me just pause the sharing real quick. Okay. Okay, is that full screen for everybody?
Yes, that's looking good.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for bearing with me. Okay, so the name of today's session is Being Intentional in Connecting Inclusive Communication Best Practices. So a lot about what we're going to talk about today is sort of talking about myths and facts around accessible communication, different techniques that you can use to make your communication methods more inclusive. And of course, this is not everything, right? Like, we're all still learning. So I would love to hear some ways at the end that you and your institution or organization in the chat might be instituting some of these methods, and maybe some new ones that we don't talk about today. First, let's sort of talk about some very common misconceptions. There's a lot of myths out there. The first one is that accessible content only benefits a small population, and that is found to not be true. There are lots of populations out there that can take advantage of more accessibly made content. That can include the aging population, physically or cognitively impaired, or those that are just less digitally skilled. So I always like to say that accessible content is good content, period. Another myth is that checking your content to see if it's accessible is expensive and time consuming. That is not true, especially in 2023. Most tools are free or low cost to implement, and a lot of the things take less than 10 minutes. For example, most Adobe Acrobats already have some accessibility checks built into the PDF component. I know a lot of my design software these days are sort of introducing accessibility components. Google Slides, for example, has lots of built-in components to it. And then, of course, if your institution purchases enterprise licenses or sort of advertises different aspects of accessibility tools in their toolbox, make sure that you're utilizing everything that your institution or organization has to offer. Another myth is that everything has to be black and white. We'll talk a little bit about this later. I do like to start out a lot of my creative things in black and white. That is sort of a good foundation, but it does not have to stay there. I enjoy color. I am wearing a very bright salmon dress and a very royal blue cardigan. I love color. I studied color. I think that it is very important and it has a story to tell. It's just an important story that we want to make sure that everybody can also take part in. Color contrast is what's going to be important. And it's actually very easy to accomplish. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But color is subjective. So what are we talking about when we talk about a color? What I think is sort of a salmon color may look more orange to you. So it's really about the contrast and what colors you're using with that one that will allow it to become accessible. And last but certainly not least, alt text is an extra step and it's not necessary for all images. That is not true. So alt text also will be the descriptor that will appear for anyone that's not able to see an image. And that can be a multitude of reasons why someone cannot see an image. It might not be a physical ability that they don't have. It can be poor internet connection. Or for example, when I worked in healthcare, the system would automatically, the work email system would automatically pull any external images and some internal images for that matter. And so what it would do is, I'm sure you're all familiar, it would sort of leave this empty box and I could usually see the alt text or image description in that field before I sort of accepted the ability to view those images. So again, alt text is not an extra step. It's very necessary. And again, making all of your images accessible is better for everybody. So let's talk a little bit about color. Color can be subjective, and that's why contrast is so important. And that's why we talk a lot about color, but really contrast is sort of what we're talking about here. I really love this quote that vision is fundamentally ambiguous. I thought that was such a good quote to sort of round out what I'm trying to say today, which is that the brain reconstructs the outside world in different ways. And that depends on each of us. So it depends on what we're taught. It depends on our physical abilities. It depends on sort of the nature that we grow up in, the literal physical place where we grow up in, what colors we're exposed to, the schools we go to, everything. You know, the brain can really interpret color and vision in a multitude of different ways. I put this example on the screen. This is the infamous blue, black, gold, white dress that ruined everyone's summers a couple of years ago. But this was the quintessential example of why color and contrast is subjective. It is based on what something is next to. So if those that are not familiar, this dress took the internet by storm. If I'm not mistaken, the blue and black is the actual dress, but a lot of people saw white and gold, and that was based purely on the light. The lighting situation when the photo was taken, and also are all in individual eyes. Some people immediately saw the contrast, and some people immediately saw what I'm going to call the reverse of those two colors. So if there is ever an example as to why color is subjective, this is it. Half the country saw one thing, half the country saw another. And so I just like to say that color is important, and it definitely has a story to be told, but maybe don't make that the whole story. I would not say, I would not give this presentation to a class and say, the blue and black dress, blah, blah, blah. That, we really want to just sort of focus on the one thing that's on the screen and describe it that way. I've also seen folks say things like, refer to my answers below in red. Well, if that person doesn't pick a high contrast enough red, we're not sure if everyone is going to get all the information that they're providing. So we just want to be sure that we're using the right contrast, because that's really the story that we're trying to tell. That sort of is a good segue into color blindness. So according to the NIH, color blindness is defined as having trouble discerning colors from each other. And this can be broken down into shade, hue, or the saturation of a color. I'm sort of geeking out a little bit into color theory 101, which I won't dive too much into today. But those are sort of the three aspects of a color that makes up a color. And that also is either subtracted or added depending on a person's sight ability. And there's also a multitude of reasons why someone might have issues with color contrast. And I've listed a couple of those here, namely poor vision. Again, we sort of talked about those myths and facts about accessibility. We're also talking about our aging population. We're also talking about people with just low vision, right? Who might have glasses but don't have them on at the time, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just necessarily people that have color blindness specifically. I have a couple examples shown here. These are sort of the top 4 different methods, or the different types of color blindness. And the URL at the bottom, I have it saved to my bookmarks. It's very, very handy. You can upload an image, or upload a URL, and it will show you all the different ways that your website or media is being shown with these 4 color blindness types. And so you can sort of check to see if your email colors are right, if your logo colors are right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'll show you sort of what we're doing here at Wake Forest in terms of setting people up for correct color contrast. That's sort of what you're looking at here. So on the left, is a set of 5 sets of 5 colors. And at Wake Forest, we come up with the idea to sort of give people set palettes of colors so that they don't have to adhere to any of these. But I think people want things easy. They want things accessible. We know when people are building out Word documents or Google Slides or PowerPoint presentations, there's sort of these like default themes, and most of them don't have the correct color contrast. So we wanted to give our folks some good tools to put in their toolbox. This is still sort of in the beta version, but I think this is a really great project, and I'm very excited about it. Those same 4 color blindness filters that you saw in the previous slide, those have been applied to this same document. And so you can sort of see what we're talking about here. And some of them are very close, I will admit, especially in the black and white version. So we've still got a little bit of work to do. But what we're looking at here is variety, because we want to give people a variety of colors to choose from, but also be very aware of how those colors look when they're beside of each other. And making sure that the contrast is there. So for example, if they are looking to make a bar graph or a pie chart, making sure that they have the right colors to choose from in the right order to get them the contrast they need to make that image accessible. Again, we're still in the beta version of this, but I think it's going to be very, very handy for people. Now let's move on to content. I cannot say this enough. Accessible content is better content. So we're talking about distilled words and simple explanations. I have been asked in the past to rewrite something to fit an 8th grade reading level. You'll oftentimes hear that sort of terminology. But really what I think they're looking for is just distilled wording, simple language. You know, flowery language or industry jargon can sometimes get in the way, depending on who our audience needs are. For example, I work in information systems, which is the IT department. So if we're communicating to a small audience about a very technical need, we will use the correct terminology for that audience. But for our students, especially, simple is better. And that is because we all read with different levels of expertise and abilities. We never want to exclude a certain group of people because they just don't understand what they're reading. So we need to sort of be very broad in the language that we choose, so that we really speak to a variety of people. That also includes sort of our English as a second language learners. We really want to be inclusive of everybody. I sort of referred to this earlier, but don't use color to convey meaning. Again, I see this a lot. See the items in red below, or see my feedback in blue. Again, if that person picks a dark navy blue to be paired right beside of a black word, there's a large audience that is not going to be able to distinguish those differences. We also know that everyone is skimming. People are reading fast. People are reading on their phones. Sometimes people are getting it read aloud to them via Siri. If I'm in the car, and I get a text message, or sometimes I'll have it read out an email to me. Those colors are not going to be distinguished with certain methods. We also want to talk about minimizing dark colors and autoplay videos and distracting animations and photos. A lot of those aspects is more about having the content that matter to stand out as being important. I have an example here of sort of an image that has a moving GIF aspect to it that sort of shows a hand scrolling down a dashboard and viewing different bar graphs and charts. Am I getting anything out of that more than I would if that was just a still image? Probably not. I think their goal is to be eye-catching and to get my attention, but I think you can do that in other ways. For example, they have a very large header font. That would get my attention just as easily as that somewhat distracting GIF animation that's embedded in that image. This is a graph of something called an empathy map. So empathy mapping is a method of thinking where you try to anticipate the patterns of your users, of your readers, and the methods of which they will process that information. This is really, really handy for multiple reasons. Not only does it usually produce accessible content, but it also can help remove biases. And it sort of helps to usher in new ways of thinking about something. And so that usually gives you a variety of ways to reach the same goal. So the example I have on the screen is you can use a step-by-step infographic. That gets us to one goal, but how else can we get to that goal in a more accessible way? Because we know that infographics can't have a tendency to not be the most accessible form of communicating sort of these step-by-steps. So an empathy map sort of looks like what's on the screen. It's a quadrant of 4 squares with sort of the user being the central piece of that. So one quadrant is going to be talking about what our user might say. So the example I have on the screen now is buying a TV. So we have our user Jamie. And so we think about, what is Jamie going to say about buying a TV? Well, they might be disappointed in something. They might be questioning the dimensions of the TV. They might not know where to start. They might not know what brands to choose first. So we're trying to think about how our user might question themselves. Then we're going to talk about how we're going to think about how the user is thinking. What are some thoughts? So maybe they want something really awesome. Maybe they're confused because there's too many acronyms and they don't understand what RGB means. DPI, we use lots of acronyms in today. Maybe they don't know which one is best. Maybe they are questioning whether they're wasting too much time researching. So how are they thinking? Then we have what the user does. So they're probably going to check out a website to do some research to buy their TV. They're probably going to go to the store to compare products in person. And they're probably going to ask their friends. They're probably going to ask their community for input and user experience. And then lastly, how are they feeling? Well, they might be scared because they might be spending a lot of money on this TV and they might be disappointed. But also probably they're really excited. They're going to get a new TV and maybe the Super Bowl is coming up and they're like excited to have all their friends over to see this new TV. So sort of analyzing what the user says, thinks, does, and feels can really sort of go back to that distilled language, those simple words, get us to a place where we can answer the user's 4 quadrants in a way that conveys the information accurately and accessibly, in a way that they can get their questions answered. I love this. I have this empathy map image saved in my documents, and I often pull it up, especially when I am being asked to communicate something that I might not be familiar with myself. So sometimes I'll put myself in that user position and think, what am I saying? What am I thinking? What do I want to do next? And how am I feeling about this? And that helps me answer those questions and get some good accessible content. Another thing empathy mapping can do is provide really good context for what you're doing. This is a great answer to alt text. Like, you'll sort of see that there's this pattern, there's these steps that really make making accessible content easy, because you'll get there. Sort of if you do step 1, step 2 comes naturally, and step 3 comes naturally. You're not having to sort of sit and really dwell on what is this alt text going to be. You've already answered that. This example on the screen is one that we've worked on in our accessibility team. This is a picture of the Mona Lisa, but we've got 3 examples of alt text that are sort of rated fair, good, and best, right? But what that alt text is going to be depends a lot on that empathy mapping and the context for which we're making that alt text. So for example, if this Mona Lisa painting is for an art history website, we might mention the year. We might mention Renaissance. We might mention more art history terms. If it's a course on feminism, we might be referring to the slight smile on her face or the posture for which Mona Lisa sits. But if it's for a painting class, we might be talking about Da Vinci. We might be talking about certain textures on the canvas, or this is an example of oil painting. So again, alt text, it gives us context, and we can get those answers from this sort of thought process of empathy mapping when we're creating our content. And content is king. We hear this a lot, and it's sort of an old sort of motto, if you will, but it is still true. Short line length and sentences is key. So I have a graphic on the screen now that sort of shows you visually the same paragraph, but sort of at 50%, 75%, and what I'm going to consider 100%. Studies have long shown, even when I was in school a long time ago, that short line length is it. That, you know, again, we're talking about skimmers, we're talking about people that read fast, and this is just the way to go to get your content readable and more accessible to more people. It's also easier. We know that if you have too many words in a sentence, that you lose people, not only visually, but also cognitively. So I loved this fact that I found from a communications expert, that if a sentence has 14 words or less, 90% of their audience can comprehend it. You go over that 15-word mark and you start to lose folks. They either get bored, or again, folks that might have some sort of cognitive disability, or maybe a visual disability where they just kind of start to blur off the page after a little while. You're going to get that info if you get it to them quicker. Language choice and structure is sort of, again, the drilled down version of sort of what we're talking about when we talk about content being accessible and content being king. So be careful with lingo and jargon, and use capitalization for sort of emphasis. So you'll hear camel case, or in my design software, it's often referred to as title case. And then maybe spell out or explain that jargon later. This also goes great with acronyms. So on the screen, I have an example of a logo for the Wake Forest IT help portal, which is called Ask Deek. But the way that it is typed out in language is one word, just ASK, capital D, EAC. When you run that through a screen reader, it's going to pronounce it asked, because it thinks that that's just all one word, right? So being careful that we explain that later, or add necessary punctuation, add necessary spaces, so that any sort of made up, for lack of better words, or words that are institutional words are explained out for those who may not be familiar with it. Ordered lists are great. They are fantastic for accessible content because they are read in the order, but they are great for skimmers. I think all of us have our phones, we have our iPads, tablets, we're getting emails, and we really just want that ordered list. Boom, boom, boom. What do I need to do? It's just crucial, I think, in this day and age. A very important aspect of listing, especially if you are a designer or use design software such as InDesign or Illustrator, is to avoid using wingdings or webdings to represent bullets in design software. So I have a screenshot here for you. This is what it looks like in Adobe Illustrator. The highlighted character is actually a lowercase l. So for example, Illustrator does have a bulleted list capability, but for flexibility or ease of use, sometimes you want to reach for a different character. Sometimes you don't want just a bullet. Sometimes you want like a cute little checkbox, or maybe you want a list of check icons. The sort of old school of thought, or the thought process that I was taught in school, was to utilize these character font typefaces, font families, to get those visual components. But of course, what we find is when you run this through a screen reader, it is reading the letter that I have typed. So I've typed a lowercase l, highlighted it, changed the typeface to wingdings, and I get this nice bullet. But that's not going to be accessible for someone who's using a screen reader. So use that bulleted list capability in the design software, or you could draw a circle, but again, you lose that ordered list capability that's going to be read out by the screen reader. And I have another example to show you to sort of elaborate a little bit more on that. We also want to utilize heading structure properly. Again, when I first got started, I chose the heading type based on styling. So I would just sort of run through the list of all the available headings, all the available, paragraph tags. And I was like, oh, this one looks great, but it would be like all heading 4, right? That's not the way we need to go about it. We need to sort of start at the root, and either whatever mechanism you're using, whether it's MailChimp or coding your own website or WordPress, CMS, you want to make sure on the back end that you've styled those things the way you want them to be. So if you want your heading 1 to always be a dark blue, if you want your heading 2s to always be in italics, do that on the back end. And so then you can go and select the proper heading tag for that line of text. so that it shows up properly to a screen reader, and that anyone using a tool will hit those headings and be able to drill down in that content in the right way. Don't just fill your page up with heading 4s because you like the way it looks. Make the heading 1 the way you want it to be. That way it both looks the way you want it to and becomes accessible content. And I cannot emphasize enough, this is great for skimmers. This is great for people on mobile devices and tablets too. That way they can see what's most important. Moving on to web coding. So I don't know if a lot of you are sort of in the web coding world, or if you're utilizing a CMS for that. So I'm just going to briefly touch on this, but there may be some times where you need to address certain parts of HTML coding. So we just want to make sure that we properly assign code with the right title or the right label, depending on what it is, so that, again, a screen reader or anyone using a tool to sort of digest that information gets told the right thing. We also want to avoid nesting. One huge boo-boo that I used to do when I first started out was you would sort of make like a div code, and then you would put like a span code inside of that, and then you would put a paragraph code inside of that. And so those is like nesting of things, right? And the thought process was that gave you more flexibility to arrange it differently or style it differently. But what we really need to do is pull that stuff out, get rid of the nesting, get rid of the unnecessary code, and just label things properly, and you'll get there. ARIA code, I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with that terminology, but it is a set of code that you can insert into your HTML in order to assign it to be read to the screen reader a certain way. I have some examples on the screen. So the first box does not have any code assigned to it, any ARIA code assigned to it, but the second one does. So we can see how this would be for sort of like a form. If someone was filling out a contact form on a website, making sure that gets read in the right way, especially if there is an error code. So in this particular line of code, what we're having is if someone does not put their first name, let's say they skip the box, a little code pops up that reminds them, enter your first name. But that would not show up to someone in a screen reader because it's a product of an action. So making sure that they get the same information just because they are not seeing the alert that pops up right away. And that's just one example. And we're, again, going back to color accessibility, especially with buttons. So we all have seen emails and web pages where it's click here to register, and we have this button, and it might be a light yellow color with a white text box inside of it. We still have to keep in mind color contrast codes. So when you're coding out colors, make sure you're picking those sort of hex codes that will give you good contrast when they're next to each other. Again, I have a Post-it note on my desktop in my office with just some sort of really quick color combination hex codes that deal with our school colors and the combinations that they need to be in order to give good color contrast when I'm coding web buttons or coding pop-up boxes or anything like that. I'll also add to this that if you are using a CMS system such as WordPress or Drupal, a lot of those have some accessibility tools built in. For example, WordPress has lots of plugins that are available to you. Most of them are free or very low cost, and it will help you. It'll help me flag certain things after I've made a page. It will highlight in red the parts that might be missing. So make sure to use those free goodies. Another thing that we've talked about is link text. So the link text should be descriptive and never click here. When I started out, the old school thought was click here, all caps, and then you would add like 3 brackets behind it. You would just do anything to sort of catch their attention. But we know that that's not necessarily the way that we should be doing it anymore. This example I have is saying Wake Forest University identity standards. And those 5 words are a hyperlink to the identity standards page. That gives the user a clear idea of where they're going. I will also add here that that is not only for people who need accessible content, but also for people that work in environments where there are strict email, spam, or phishing tools. So when I worked for a healthcare organization, every link in our email address, I'm sorry, every link that we were given in an email would then be spelled out. They would spell out the URL in brackets afterwards, right? And that was sort of to let you know exactly where you're going before you click on it. They would spell out that URL. That can get a little messy. So I prefer this. And some people don't have that mechanism in their industry email account. This tells me exactly where I'm going to go. Click here, does not. Tables. Tables is another very important aspect of certain websites and functionality. We use tables on the Wake Forest IS webpage occasionally in sort of a matrix kind of component. And you need to make sure that you include row and column labels. I don't have an example of that code on the page because this was sort of a very brief dipping the toe into the web design world, but you can find those resources on Google. There's lots of really good resources to help you get accessible web code, but each row and each column will have certain labels so that when a person using a screen reader is tabbing through that information, that not only does it go in the right order, but it's reading out to them exactly what they're seeing in each cell of that table. And lastly, define your page focus and make sure that it is a color with good contrast. So the example I have on the slide is a drop-down menu on the Wake Forest IS page. And our focus color is like a bright cyan. And you can see it there, how we have this box that's highlighted around that first tab. That tells me exactly where I am visually. And then also what that tells me is that someone with a screen reader, when they tab into that submenu, that's their first selection. And I can follow that progression on the page as you tab through so that I know as a web designer that they're getting the right order, that nothing's being skipped as they tab through the page. So we want to make sure that we always define the page focus. Designing for print. We sort of touched on this earlier in our myths and facts slide, but logo creation should always be functional in black and white. When I was starting out in my design classes, we only designed things in black and white. That's sort of the fundamental place where you need to start. If I'm working on sort of a logo or a brand for a new initiative or a campus program, the first thing I do is sketch it out, and that's black and white. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, but sort of fundamentally, if it doesn't function in black and white, then it's not going to be accessible. And it's not necessarily telling the story that you want it to tell. So don't use sort of like color gradients in a logo to mean something. There are some people that are not going to be able to see that, whether it's due to color blindness or visual impairment. They're not going to get that message. So we want to make sure that we are providing that high contrast and making sure that it's functional, even if it's black and white. We sort of touched on this earlier with that screenshot, but always avoid using character typefaces as bullets or lists. Again, I have an example here. This is a flyer we made for our Canvas implementation. And this was my learning example. I often refer to this as how I learned that this happened. So I had a bulleted list, but then I had a sub list or sort of like a tab indented section, and I wanted it to look different. So I used the WebDings to give me flag 90-degree triangle bullets for these like next 4 indented bullets. But that is actually the lowercase u letter. So when that was put through a screen reader, it would say the character U, which makes no sense, right? So we need to try to avoid that. And this was sort of where I learned that was the situation. And PDF should be supplemental. I know that there's another session that sort of elaborates a little bit more on this, but making sure that the PDF is the supplement. It's not the key content, and it's not the only place where you need to go in order to get that information. So for example, this Canvas flyer, we also had a Google Doc version of it, so that content was somewhere else and accessible somewhere else. I'm cognizant of, yeah.
Sorry, just wanted to pop in, Emily, and let you know
Yeah.
that you've got about 10 minutes left.
Perfect. All right, 10 minutes, because I want to allow a few minutes for questions. So we'll breeze kind of through this. Designing for email. Less is more. We've sort of pretty much covered that. That distilling down your language is definitely the way to go. We want to avoid images with embedded text. So this is an example of sort of an email graphic that was made advertising a chair yoga and aromatherapy session, but the date, the time, the place, what it is, all of that is embedded in that graphic. And you don't have to use design software like I do, Illustrator and InDesign. People make these sorts of things in Canva, right? So making sure that if you do something like this, also have that typed out somewhere else. This also includes social media. So if we were to recreate this image, recycle it and put it on our Instagram, making sure that the date, time, place, all that information is also typed out and accessible for someone, because this is not actual live text here. In 2022, Gmail started rolling out alt text for inset images. And I use inset specifically because that is what they call like an image within an email. This is not an attachment. You can see I have a little screenshot here. We have this beautiful bird watercolor painting. And now if you double click on that image in the email platform, you get this sort of alt text descriptive pop-up. Wake is a Google campus. So this is sort of this is sort of the only thing I'm familiar with. Maybe Outlook or other platforms have very similar or equivalent places for this. If you are using third-party web-based platforms, so we're talking about MailChimp, Constant Contact, iContact, all of those offer alt text options as well. You may have to dig around a little bit. For ours, it's usually just a double click on the image where you get all these sort of image properties. Sometimes you'll see it said as a descriptor or descriptive text or description. All of those sort of feed into that alt text screen reader capability. Another thing to think about when you're designing for email is mobile customization. So we're talking about our friends that are using their mobile devices and their tablets all the time for their emails. We want everything to look nice. We want them to get the same experience and the same information. But there are also other reasons why you might want to offer mobile customizations to your email. For example, there are other people that use other readers and other reading devices that aren't always the same resolution as a laptop or a desktop monitor. Entering those mobile customizations or any sort of customization for screen or browser width is going to, again, make sure that our information is accessible to anyone that's using any sort of reading tool. Social media, we touched on this a little bit. We use social media to interact and form communities and learn, and we want everyone to have access to those resources. So when you're making graphics for Facebook or Instagram, and if you have any embedded information, we want to be sure that that is also typed out. And almost all social media has sort of an alt text capability for any of your imagery. Always make sure to link out for another avenue for information. So for example, like how to get help or how to read more. Giving that link out is always good. We never want to make sure that all the important information we have is limited to a social media caption. You know, we want to make sure we have that information somewhere else. With hashtags. So we want to try to place hashtags in a comment. I have an example here on the screen. So we have the Little Spoon account, which is like a baby puree food company. So they have their caption to their Instagram. And then in a comment right under it, they've listed their hashtags. This will give them the same search effect as someone who is searching one of these hashtags, but it doesn't mess up the caption. Sometimes you'll hear people say to put the hashtag at the end. That works too, but think about how a person with a screen reader would be hearing that hashtag this, hashtag that. So when you put it in the comment, it sort of limits it a little bit to how it's being read. And we also want to remember to use camel case for those multi-word hashtags so that we get the right sort of cadence to how we want that comment or that hashtag to be read. I think this is a good place to wrap up, but SEO, the scapegoat. So search engine optimization, or SEO, is a way to better optimize your web page by sort of using search terms, buzzwords. There's a whole wizardry to it, right? We want our web page to show up in the top Google hits. Therefore, we put as many of these crazy words in as possible. That's not really a good mechanism for accessible content, though. Someone does not need to hear a bunch of industry jargon over and over and over again, just so your page gets pulled up to the top of the Google rankings. There's much better ways to do that. For a long time, at least in my world, there was sort of the school of thought in marketing that you could hide search terms within alt text. I have to say, just a few years ago, I heard someone else mention this a little bit, and it made me quiver. Try not to use don't use alt text as a way to just insert search terms or competitor brands or schools to try to have your stuff pop up when another institution is Googled. That's not the way to go. That's sort of an abuse of the alt text. Now, of course, there might be times where your alt text includes industry jargon or institutional words, but don't use it as some sort of alternative method to increase your SEO. We want to avoid those buzzwords and industry jargon, and we want to make sure that we're using very good descriptive file names, because sometimes those are used as our backup alt text. So in conclusion, do use techniques like empathy mapping to sort of think ahead and anticipate your audience's needs. We want to slim down our content so that we really filter out what's important. That's efficient for screen readers. That's efficient for those with reading challenges and for folks that just don't want to scroll. We want to be open to change. We talk a lot at Wake about progress, not perfection, and we are all learning. Please make sure that you're using all the tools that are available to you. Make sure to reach out to your institution if there is a tool that you like and want to have on sort of an enterprise level. And don't ever feel like it's impossible or too hard or not needed, because accessible content is better for everybody. And that is how I will end this today. I have a references and appendix slide with some really great links to referencing back to some of the things that I put in my slides. And the work continues. Please connect with me. My email is on the screen. I will also drop it in the chat.
All right, thanks, Emily. That was great. A lot of great information there. We do have several questions.
Sure.
So if we're ready, the first question is related to GIFs. It says, do you recommend using GIFs to show users where parts of a software are located, or would you rely on video or regular images?
That's a great question. For the example that is given about parts of a piece of software, and this is my personal opinion, I would probably be inclined to say no. It's funny because we were just looking at a link a couple of days ago about how Giphy, sort of like a GIF library website, is exploring alt text at the moment. I sort of see GIFs as extra, some bells and whistles. So I'm not sure I would put important information in them. I would sort of either opt for a video or maybe some still screenshots.
Okay, great. Our next question looks like it's related to jargon words. So it says, I would like to make definitions of jargon words available near their occurrence in the website, but not require users to read through a large amount of definitions if they don't need to. Do you have any suggestions for best practice? And is there easy HTML code to add?
Yeah, that's great. My first gut reaction is a glossary. I think that is a great idea. Also, we talked about search engine optimization. I think a benefit of that is any time you add an extra page to your website and you use sort of industry jargon, that will boost your search engine optimization naturally. A glossary seems like a perfect fit. I could see it sort of as a footer on every web page. You could do sort of an asterisk on certain things and link out to the glossary page for that particular term. Yeah, that's sort of my first reaction.
That's great. All right, so another question related to PDFs, and just asking if you could elaborate a bit more on what you mean by PDF. The PDF should be supplemental, and why exactly that is.
So for a variety of reasons, I think a PDF should be supplemental. One is sort of just flexible content, right? We know that if we have a Google Doc, if we have a native web page, we can change that text on the fly. PDF, it's embedded, and it entails opening a design file, making the change, sending the PDF back. That's just an added extra step. It's nice to have something that we can just change on the fly for a typo, or if a piece of software changes names. That flexibility is really nice. Also, PDFs have come a long way in terms of being accessible by screen readers and reading tools. I find it hard to find one that gets it like 100%. Like we're still like sort of in the 85% range, in my opinion. And there are some really good tools within Acrobat where you can assign headers, and you can assign images alt text, and you can assign images to be decorative. It just doesn't necessarily seem to be the most accessible way to get your information out. So like, for example, I showed that Canvas flyer. We had that as a PDF, and we had like a click here for a printable PDF. And that was good for the vast majority of our audience. But we also had a Google Doc that people could refer to, and screen readers could adapt to. So if you printed it out, that was one way of accessing it. If you wanted it digitally, we had a Google Doc. You could access it that way.
Great, thanks for that.
Yeah.
Another question. So this is talking about audio description. It says, any recommendations for video hosting services that support audio descriptions? And I'm not sure that was something that you touched a lot on, but if you have any thoughts about that.
Sure. I think naturally we think about YouTube, right? And it has some capabilities. It has a captioning aspect, and it does have a descriptive aspect. At Wake, we utilize a software called Kaltura that seems to be accessible. Captioning is great. You can edit the captions after they're done. They're sort of machine generated, and then you can edit them after the fact. And has seemed to be an accessible method for our videos at the institution.
All right. And another question just came in related to footnotes.
Yes.
Person says, someone at my institution said that footnotes are not accessible. Are they not?
So I think when I used the term footnote, I don't know if I was meaning sort of the really technical footnote, like in a Word document. But it sounds like it sort of depends on the formatting and the platform that you're talking about when you say a footnote. When I was using that term, I think I was just referring to sort of a reference to a line of text at the bottom of the page. But I know that like Microsoft Word has a footnote capability that's sort of embedded in the document. But it sounds like it would just kind of depend on the platform and how that text is formatted.
All right, so that's all of the questions that have come through so far. We're right at 10:54. So we can take this time to take a break. There are a few other questions that anyone has. You can certainly drop them in the Q&A section now. If not, we can pause and take a break for our 11 o'clock session. And do want to say thanks so much, Emily, for the presentation. A lot of great information. I especially love the website that you mentioned, the Toptal. Did not have that in my resource toolkit, so I'm going to add that for myself.
Yes, and a little helper. If you have an image that you want to go through that color filter, upload it to your Google Drive, and it will accept a Google Drive link. So if you can do a Google Drive link through that filter.